Hello, I'm Doug Wentz, and welcome to Make Moderates Matter. In my last two videos, I presented a condensed version of the speech that I delivered on the front steps of the Pennsylvania State Capitol building in Harrisburg shortly before the 2024 presidential election, entitled Donald Trump's January 6th Insurrection and Endless Corruption. Why Don't You Care? As part of that speech, which was reported on in the local press by Jan Murphy of Penn Live Patriot News, I endorsed Kamala Harris for president and stated that, in my view, Donald Trump was unfit to be president of the United States because he incited a violent insurrection against the U.S. government on January 6th and had an appallingly long history of corruption, grift, and unethical conduct. Alas, as we all now know, Trump won the election. And moreover, some moderates must have voted for Trump or he would not have been elected. So the question I now want to consider is why some moderates may have voted for Trump and how we nevertheless can all work together to make moderates matter. Stay tuned. Welcome back. When I started to consider why some moderates may have voted for Donald Trump, I began by revisiting some of the comments I received after my speech. While many comments were supportive, others, of course, were not, and one in particular stood out. In this email, the writer, after a somewhat salty introduction, concluded that, bottom line, if there was just a smudge or any way your corrupt justice system could have charged Trump with insurrection, they would have done so. It didn't. Why not, Doug? Now, I have to say this struck a chord with me because it raises an important point. Despite everything I reviewed in my speech, including the fact that, as reported by the New York Times, Trump was impeached in the House for incitement of insurrection, and as reported by Politico, was found by a Colorado court to have engaged in insurrection as part of the 14th Amendment litigation, the Department of Justice, for its part, didn't actually charge Trump with insurrection. Instead, as reported by the AP, Trump was indicted for lesser crimes like conspiring to defraud the United States and obstructing an official proceeding. This presumably was done for strategic reasons, as these lesser crimes would be easier to prove and still carried significant penalties, including a maximum term of 20 years in prison, which at Trump's age would effectively be a life sentence. Nevertheless, the failure to charge Trump with insurrection apparently gave some Americans, including the fellow who sent me this email, the impression that Trump had not, in fact, incited an insurrection. Which brings me to the broader topic of the questionable way in which the Department of Justice approached the case against Trump. It seems to me that when Merrick Garland was appointed by President Biden to be Attorney General, he had one overriding challenge: to promptly indict and prosecute Trump and his co-conspirators for their role in inciting the violent attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Instead, even though the whole world watched live on television as Trump urged his supporters to march on the Capitol and fight like hell, Garland dithered. As reported by ABC News, Garland didn't appoint Jack Smith as special prosecutor to investigate Trump until November of 2022, almost 2 years after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And worse still, Trump wasn't indicted by a grand jury until August of 2023, more than 2.5 years after the insurrection. And by then, of course, it was too late. A Politico Ipsos poll showed that 61% of Americans wanted Trump to stand trial before the election. But of course, he did not. Instead, in one of the greatest failures of law enforcement in American history, after Trump pleaded not guilty, he was not even put on trial before the election, let alone found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Almost 4 years after the events of January 6th, there Donald Trump was on the ballot as if nothing untoward had happened. And since all men are innocent until proven guilty, many voters apparently felt justified in setting aside their concerns about Trump's alleged misconduct to focus instead on the policy differences between Trump and Harris. And once that occurred, a significant portion of the electorate, including many moderates, chose Trump over Harris, which was absolutely their right as voters. As for the policy differences that may have differentiated Trump and Harris, there were many, but I will focus on two that Gallup reported were key in the 2024 election: the economy, specifically inflation, and illegal immigration. In each case, in my view, Harris and the Democrats lost votes because they failed to move to the center and appeal to moderate voters. As regards the inflation issue, it's a complex problem that has many causes, but a reasonable argument can be made that Biden's policies made it worse. Inflation was a global issue that followed the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many economists agree that debt can be a useful tool for economic growth, especially in times of crisis. As such, during the first Trump administration, as reported by the AP, the U.S. passed on a bipartisan basis two large pandemic aid bills, the $2.2 trillion CARES Act of March of 2020 and a $900 billion follow-up bill in December of 2020. But under Biden, as reported by the AP, in March of 2021, the Democrats passed yet another $1.9 trillion stimulus as the American Rescue Plan, directing payments of up to $1,400 to tens of millions of Americans. Unlike the first two packages, this third round of stimulus did not have bipartisan support, in part because by then, as reported by the Government Accountability Office, the U.S. national debt had risen $4.2 trillion over the last year to a total of nearly $27 trillion, due largely to the government's COVID-19 response. Moreover, some economists, including even some Democrats, argued that Biden's third round of stimulus was unnecessary, excessive, and likely to overheat the economy. For example, in an opinion piece in the Washington Post, Larry Summers, who had served as Barack Obama's top economic advisor, warned there was a risk the American Rescue Plan could trigger inflation at a rate we had not seen in a generation. Worse still, it was becoming apparent that literally billions of dollars of COVID-19 relief aid was being stolen or wasted. By June of 2023, the Associated Press reported that fraudsters potentially stole more than $280 billion in COVID relief funding by, among other things, using the Social Security numbers of dead people and federal prisoners to get stimulus checks. In seeking to quickly spend trillions of dollars in relief aid, the government conducted much too little oversight and instituted too few restrictions on applicants, so fraud was just way too easy. To be fair to President Biden and the Democrats, the third round of COVID relief was not the only policy that increased the national debt and contributed to inflation. In 2017, for example, President Trump enacted a tax cut that significantly raised the deficit even before COVID. ProPublica reported that Trump's sharp reduction in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% took a big bite out of federal revenue, and with no corresponding reduction in spending, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the tax cut would increase deficits by about $1.9 trillion over 11 years. Nevertheless, this did little to slow the spending under the Biden administration. In addition to pushing the third round of COVID relief, in November of 2021, as reported by the AP, Biden signed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It included $1 trillion in additional spending over 5 years to upgrade roads, bridges, public transit, and high-speed internet. The plan received broad bipartisan support, but as reported by the Committee for a Responsible Budget, the CBO estimated that the plan would add $400 billion to the deficit. President Biden also made student loan debt forgiveness a cornerstone of his administration, even though it too was expected to contribute further to inflation. When Biden's student debt forgiveness plan was announced in August of 2022, the Committee for a Responsible Budget estimated that it would cost $500 billion over a decade and would meaningfully boost inflation. And moreover, Biden's student debt forgiveness plan was unpopular. Critics argued that it was fundamentally unfair to those who already paid off their loans, who made sacrifices to avoid taking loans in the first place, or who chose not to go to college at all. As such, in June of 2024, shortly before the presidential election, the AP reported that Biden's plan was getting tepid reviews at best, even among those holding student debt. Polls showed that only 30% of adults said they approved of how Biden was handling his student loan forgiveness program, while 40% disapproved. Eventually, after inflation increased to the highest level in 4 decades, President Biden attempted to address the problem through his Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Despite its name, however, the act, which did not have bipartisan support, was not expected to meaningfully reduce inflation. On the one hand, as reported by USA Today, the act was projected to generate savings of about $739 billion by increasing tax collections and lowering prescription drug prices, which was all fine and good. But on the other hand, the act also authorized even more spending, $433 billion on energy and climate change initiatives and extensions of subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. As such, as reported by the AP, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office concluded that the Inflation Reduction Act, despite its name, would not in fact reduce inflation, but would have a negligible impact on inflation in the short term and zero impact on inflation over the next decade. In my view, all of this spending suggests that the Democrats failed to appreciate how much people were hurting as a result of inflation. As reported by Newsweek and Fox Business, once inflation became evident, the Biden administration called it temporary and transitory, and showed little sense of urgency in communicating a decisive plan to combat the problem. The Biden administration could have moderated its approach and pivoted to more genuine inflation-fighting policies like deficit reduction, but did not. Eventually, the rate of inflation began to fall, and as the Wall Street Journal reported, Democrats argued that Biden's policies created a quote-unquote soft landing without a recession. This arguably was true, but overlooked the fact that prices remained far higher than when Biden took office, so that as the AP and NBC News reported, many Americans weren't cheering the soft landing. As reported by USA Today, inflation reached a 40-year peak in mid-2022, and while inflation cooled after that to an annual rate of just 2.6% in October of 2024, prices nevertheless were far higher, about 21.4% higher, than in February of 2020. As such, fair or not, many Americans, including apparently many moderates, did not approve of Biden's overall handling of the economy. In October of 2024, shortly before the election, a Gallup poll found that 54% of voters believed that Donald Trump was better able to handle the economy than Kamala Harris, who, as Biden's vice president, was viewed by voters as inheriting Biden's policies. As regards the second major issue of the election, that of illegal immigration, Biden and the Democrats didn't fare much better. For many years, Trump's supporters had been chanting to build a wall along the entire border with Mexico. Nevertheless, for reasons I still cannot fathom, the Biden administration allowed illegal border crossings to reach record levels. As reported by the BBC, statistics show that after January of 2021, when President Biden came to office, there were about 8 million encounters along the Mexico border with illegal immigrants, while under the Trump administration, there were only 2.4 million encounters. Under Biden, as reported by Brookings, encounters with migrants rose to 1.7 million in fiscal 2021, 2.4 million in fiscal 2022, and 2.5 million in fiscal 2023. In response, as reported by the Migration Policy Institute, President Biden increased the number of deportations, so much so that as of June of 2024, the U.S. actually was on track to carry out as many removals as under the first Trump administration. Nevertheless, the increased deportation effort was not enough to offset the significant increase in the number of border encounters. As the crisis escalated, eventually in early 2024, as reported by NPR and NBC News, a comprehensive bipartisan immigration bill was introduced in the Senate, which aimed to address the border security and asylum processes. It was the first such comprehensive immigration bill since the last one was enacted almost 4 decades earlier during the Reagan administration. The bill was very much a moderate approach and a bipartisan compromise that would take practical, concrete steps to address a complex problem. For example, the bill did not include building a wall along the entire border with Mexico, as Trump had wanted, but allocated billions of dollars in funding to expand border security and increase detention capacity. It would continue the asylum process, but also include a border shutdown mechanism that would require the Department of Homeland Security to restrict or close the border to asylum claims if certain thresholds of daily or weekly border encounters were met. The bill would reinstate the Trump-era Remain in Mexico policy that would require asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their claims are processed in the U.S., but also included funding to facilitate faster processing of asylum claims. Despite initial bipartisan support, however, Trump criticized the plan, and the bill, which took 4 months to negotiate, collapsed within 4 days. The easiest explanation, as reported by Brookings, was that Republicans yielded to Trump's objections, preferring to keep the border crisis aflame for the November election. Significantly, however, some Democrats also expressed concern about the bill's impact on asylum seekers. Regardless, from where I sit, I truly cannot understand why the Biden administration didn't make illegal immigration a top priority and instead waited 3 years to attempt to propose a moderate, bipartisan solution to the problem. If President Biden had pursued immigration reform in earnest as soon as he took office in 2021, it is far more likely that a compromise, moderate immigration package like the one proposed in 2024 could have been enacted. That truly would have been a historic achievement, which likely would have convinced many Americans, including moderates, that Democrats were serious about immigration reform. Instead, the Biden administration allowed border encounters to increase significantly, to the point that illegal immigration was viewed as an unresolved crisis in the 2024 election. By then, a Pew Research Center survey found that 61% of Americans rated immigration as very important in determining how they would vote, a 9 percentage point increase from the 2020 presidential election. And moreover, polling by YouGov throughout the election found that voters were far more likely to prefer Trump than Harris on handling immigration. The YouGov polling found that 49% of Americans believed that Trump would handle immigration better, while only 35% felt that Harris would. In sum, Biden and the Democrats failed to move to the center on the immigration issue until the very last minute, which in my opinion was a significant reason why some moderates may have voted for Trump. Of course, inflation and immigration were not the only concerns in the 2024 presidential election, and I'll briefly mention one more. Much has been said about the Democratic Party veering into identity politics and political correctness and away from the interests of the working class. Some felt that the Democratic Party focused on cultural issues involving race, gender, or sexuality, but in so doing lost the support of middle-class working Americans who didn't always agree with those priorities. Now, this is a complicated subject, and I'm not prepared to wade too deeply into these waters here. But I do want to mention one issue as an example. As reported by Gallup, NBC News, and the Center Square, polling consistently shows that anywhere between 2/3 and nearly 80% of Americans don't want transgender athletes, i.e., biological men, playing in women's sports. And yet, during the 2024 presidential race, Kamala Harris skirted direct questions about transgender rights and refused to say that biological boys should not be playing in girls' sports. As reported by The Hill, this in turn was much to the chagrin of two moderate House Democrats, Tom Suozzi of New York, who, by the way, is a co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus that I discussed in episode 1, and Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, both of whom, in the immediate aftermath of Trump's win, announced that they now oppose transgender athletes competing in women's sports, shifting right of their previous policy positions. But it was too little, too late. Instead, the Harris campaign's unwillingness to say that biological boys should not be playing in girls' sports did little to convince working class and moderate voters that Harris was a common sense, center-left candidate rather than a progressive liberal who was out of touch with the views of the majority of Americans on this subject. And finally, I have to say that, apart from these policy differences, in my view, the Democrats ran a somewhat dysfunctional 2024 presidential campaign and never missed an opportunity to shoot themselves in the foot. For example, as the presidential election race drew to a close, Harris and the Democrats emphasized that Trump was a threat to democracy. This not only, as reported by Fox News, was viewed by many Republicans as violent rhetoric, but also seemed to be somewhat hypocritical because the Democratic Party itself used an undemocratic method to choose its own candidate. President Biden ran for re-election despite strongly suggesting that he would not, whereupon the Democrats failed to hold a meaningful primary and, as reported by CNN, actively blunted the campaign of Dean Phillips, who was excluded from the ballot in my current home state of Florida. Then, after President Biden's disastrous debate performance against Donald Trump, Biden dropped out of the race at the last minute and endorsed Kamala Harris, who was anointed to become the Democratic candidate without any primary at all, and without even an open convention that would have allowed the delegates to have a say in the process. Now, granted, there was no moral equivalence here between the Democratic Party's dysfunctional candidate selection process and Trump's instigation of a violent insurrection against the U.S. government on January 6, which was orders of magnitude worse. Nevertheless, in nominating Kamala Harris at the last minute without any input from the rank and file, the Democrats somehow managed, incredibly, to blur the moral high ground on the question of which party was more undemocratic. And of course, the Democrats also managed to shoot themselves in the foot when it came to the DOJ's classified documents case against Trump. As reported by the AP and CNN, after years of wrangling, Trump finally was indicted in June of 2023 for willful retention of national defense information and obstruction of justice for allegedly mishandling classified documents that he retained at his residence at Mar-a-Lago after he left the presidency. Trump pleaded not guilty. But of course, Trump was not the only prominent public official who retained classified documents. No. As reported by CNN, in January of 2023, attorneys for President Biden discovered classified government documents in Biden's former office at the Penn Biden Center in Washington, D.C., and at Biden's personal residence in Wilmington, Delaware, including in his garage. And after reporters asked Biden, "What were you thinking by keeping classified documents next to your Corvette?" Biden replied, "My Corvette's in a locked garage, so it's not like it's sitting out in the street." Joe Biden. Really, Joe? You thought it was okay to keep classified documents in a box in your garage next to your Corvette because the door was locked? And now again, there is no moral equivalence here between President Biden, who cooperated with the investigation, and Trump, who was accused of obstructing justice by intentionally moving documents to hide them from his lawyers. But try explaining that to the millions of Americans who failed to fully appreciate the distinction between the two cases. And finally, of course, as reported by Politico, in February of 2024, Special Counsel Robert Hur, who was assigned to investigate Biden's retention of classified documents, issued a report on his findings. On the one hand, Hur concluded that no criminal charges against Biden were warranted. But on the other hand, Hur determined that a key reason why Biden should not be indicted was because jurors would be unlikely to find that Biden had criminal intent because, as Hur put it, at trial, Mr. Biden would likely present himself to a jury, as he did during our interview of him, as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory, with diminished faculties and advancing age. Special Counsel Robert Hur reported pages 10 and 246. Unbelievable. You know, it wasn't enough that Biden managed to blur the line between himself and Trump's allegedly criminal retention of classified documents. No. In the process, we all had to be reminded of what most of us already suspected and later confirmed in real time during Biden's disastrous debate performance against Donald Trump, that President Biden was not physically and mentally fit to continue as president for another 4 years. Okay. I think I'll stop here. If you think you're sensing some frustration in my voice, you'd be right. So the bottom line is this. I voted for Kamala Harris for president because I felt then and continue to believe that Donald Trump is unfit to be president of the United States because he incited a violent insurrection against the U.S. government on January 6th and had an appallingly long history of corruption, grift, and unethical conduct. But does that mean that I hate the nearly half of Americans, including some moderates, who voted for Trump? Absolutely not. The Department of Justice completely failed to hold Donald Trump accountable for the events of January 6th. And because you're innocent until proven guilty, then many voters apparently were willing to look past Trump's alleged crimes and focus instead on the policy differences between Trump and Kamala Harris. And once that occurred, in my view, there were a variety of reasons why some moderates may have chosen Trump over Harris, which was absolutely their right as voters. Biden and the Democrats could have moved to the center. They could have acknowledged how much people were hurting from inflation and pivoted to more genuine inflation-fighting policies like deficit reduction. They could have pursued immigration reform from the outset, rather than allowing border encounters to increase and then waiting more than 3 years before attempting to enact a bipartisan immigration reform bill. They could have moderated their stance on at least some identity politics issues, like allowing men to play in women's sports. And President Biden could have declined to seek a second term and allowed the Democratic Party to hold a viable primary to pick another candidate. Biden and the Democrats could have done all of these things, but did not. And this, in turn, was enough justification for some moderates to vote for Trump. Now, of course, as a quick postscript, I have to mention that after Trump took office for the second time, he promptly took at least 3 key actions that may or may not have been what moderates had in mind if they voted for Trump because they were concerned about the national debt, inflation, and illegal immigration. First, as reported by NBC News, Trump pushed through his so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, estimated would add $3.4 trillion more to the national debt over the next decade. This despite the fact that, as reported by the Conference Board, as of the end of July of 2025, the total U.S. national debt had already reached a record $36.7 trillion. Second, as reported by the AP and Politico, Trump instigated a wide-ranging tariff trade war that many economists warned would worsen inflation. And third, as reported by NPR and the Los Angeles Times, the Trump administration unleashed masked immigration agents that began to spread fear and confusion across the U.S. Again, all of this may or may not be what moderates wanted and expected if they voted for Trump because they were concerned about inflation and immigration, but that's a topic for another day. Which brings us to the final question I want to consider. How can political moderates work together going forward, whether or not we voted for Trump? The answer in my mind is simple. In my first video, I noted that voters are dissatisfied with their candidates. As the presidential election was heating up in April of 2024, a Pew Research survey found that about 2/3 of voters had little or no confidence that Joe Biden was physically fit to be president, and nearly as many lacked confidence in Trump to act ethically. As a result, about half of voters said that if given the chance, they would replace both Biden and Trump on the ballot, and I would have fallen into that camp. I also noted in my first video that at least 1/3 of Americans, as reported by Gallup, or maybe even most Americans, according to Professor Anthony Fowler, are politically moderate. And yet, as reported by the Pew Research Center, partisan polarization in Congress has increased. So if all of this is true, what should we do? Well, I outlined what I'm trying to accomplish in my first video. In sum, I plan to review what it means to be a political moderate and how we can make moderates matter, whether through political parties and organizations like the moderate factions within the Republican and Democratic parties, the Forward Party, No Labels, or the emerging state parties like the New Jersey Moderate Party or United Kansas, or by changing the structure and mechanics of the voting process, including through proportional representation, ranked choice voting, fusion voting, open primaries, independent redistricting commissions to combat gerrymandering, or a combination of the above, such as the Fair Representation Act. If all of this sounds a bit intimidating, it shouldn't. The topics I'm planning to address are concrete and practical and are the types of initiatives I truly believe all moderates can support regardless of how we voted in the 2024 presidential election. For example, if the Forward Party actually manages to run a third-party candidate as an alternative to the Republicans and Democrats, this merely would give moderate voters more choices, and they certainly could support Donald Trump's Republican Party if they prefer. And if a structural reform like ranked choice voting is adopted, moderate voters would simply have more flexibility. They could vote for their first choice of candidate without fear of acting as a spoiler because they would know that if their first choice doesn't win, their vote will be counted for their second choice instead. And if you're a registered independent and live in a state with closed primaries, and the state adopts an open primary system instead, you no longer would be disenfranchised. You could vote in the primary and help to choose a candidate for the general election, which should appeal to you as an independent, whether or not you voted for Trump. And finally, in my first video, I listed some of the values I think that political moderates share. One of those values was that, in my view, political moderates want to work together respectfully with people of different viewpoints to reach sensible, pragmatic solutions to our problems. I myself did not vote for Donald Trump, but I'm committed to working together respectfully with those who did. And I'm confident that, together, we can take concrete, practical steps to make moderates matter in American politics, and I hope you will join me in that effort. Thanks for watching.